Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the most interesting, but also for some of us hard to accept claims that's made by David Hume in his Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding takes place fairly early on in section 8, which is focused on his treatment of necessity on the one hand, meaning all things have some sort of cause and we're all caught up in a massive causal matrix, and liberty or freedom of the will. And so this has to do with human actions and motivations and whether those are indeed entirely necessitated or whether they're free. And Hume will introduce this idea here that's supposed to be shoring up the side of liberty. And it certainly does perform that argumentative function within the work. So what is the thing that he's saying here? What is his contention? He tells us that it is universally acknowledged that there is a great uniformity among the actions of men in all nations and ages, and that human nature remains still the same in its principles and operations. Now that is indeed a big claim, and a big claim on two counts, right? One is just the content of the claim, that there is this great uniformity in human actions and motivations, and that this runs through all nations, all ages, and that human nature is basically the same everywhere you go. That's already a really strong substantive claim. I think you could make some sort of case for it along Humean lines. What I'm not sure that he can actually do is say that it's universally acknowledged, because what that would seem to imply is a canvassing of, indeed, all places and times to find this universal acknowledgement. If we weaken that claim to make it be 18th century Europeans, or perhaps just British, or perhaps just Scots people, are generally saying that this is the case, okay, that might be plausible, but Hume is not actually saying that. His rhetoric doesn't reflect that sort of weakening of it. And so that's something to keep in mind. Where would the registering of this universal acknowledgement actually come from? Let's move on from that. What would this actually mean? He tells us the same motives always produce the same actions. Notice the always there. He's asserting that this happens of necessity, right? The same events follow from the same causes. And then he gives some examples of how this works. And before we go into that, I should say that Hume actually does devote, early on in his career, a great amount of examination and thought to what we call the passions or the emotions and how those work, how those function as motives. And he does look at what other people before him had to say about it, and he produces a quite interesting and novel theory of his own about the passions and how they function. You want to look at the treatise on human nature for that. So he goes on and he says, ambition, avarice, self-love, vanity. These are all generally viewed as bad things. Then he talks about good things. Friendship, generosity, public spirit. These passions, mixed in various degrees and distributed through society, have been from the beginning of the world and still are the source of all the actions and enterprises which have ever been observed among mankind. Again, a very strong claim. We can look at these basic emotional states or drives or affectivities, what we're calling passions, and if we thoroughly understand those, we will be able to understand, what human nature plays out like within any society. And he gives the example of ancient Greeks and Romans, because of course, in the West, that's what they were largely focused on. Would you know the sentiments, inclinations, and course of life of the Greeks and Romans? Study the temper and actions of the French and English. The French and English are those that you have ready at hand, and you can look at them and you can say, well, French and English people and presumably other Europeans of this time behave this way. We can project that backwards into ancient Greece or ancient Rome. And we can say, well, if we've got similar circumstances, people are going to behave in similar ways. So we can transfer these observations from times and cultures to others. And then he says as well that, since humans are the same in all times and places, history informs us of nothing new or strange in this particular. The only real use of history, he says, is to discover the constant and universal principles of human nature by showing men in all varieties of circumstances and situations. And we can also talk about understanding in the present or in the past other cultures that we're not familiar with in the sense of having direct experience with. We can surmise about ancient China that the ancient Chinese were pretty much the same as, contemporary Europeans, or if we want to talk about today, if we were using Hume, contemporary Americans, or wherever you're watching this from, right? And again, that's a bit of a stretch, isn't it? But Hume is definitely committed to this idea. He also talks about another way in which we acquire knowledge of human nature. He tells us the benefit of that experience acquired by long life and a variety of business and company. So living for a long time means that you get to observe over the course of a lifetime. Presuming, of course, that you're a good observer. Presuming, of course, that you're not some ideologue who thinks they already know everything, and that you're not led astray by some problem. That you actually are paying attention to what's going on around you. So Hume wouldn't apply this, say, to drug addicts. They're probably, even if they live a long time, probably not going to be great judges of human nature, nor people who are liable to what Hume in his time called fanaticism and what we would today call, extreme partisanship, or, being a warrior in the culture wars or something like that. So, there's something to that. If you live for quite a while, you do learn things, right, if you're paying attention. And then a variety of business and company. So this is kind of important too. A variety of business and company, spending time with different people, not just hanging out, not just, finding the people who you went to high school with and hanging out with them at the bar until you're 80 years old, or talking about the glory days, actually meeting new people, going around and finding out what they think. Business, your occupations, you learn things through the engagements that you have with the rest of the world. So Hume says that there is a kind of benefit of this. He says that it instructs us in the principles of human nature, and it regulates our future conduct as well as speculation. By means of this guide, this is a wonderful line, we mount up to the knowledge of men's inclinations and motives. Now notice he gets a bit more descriptive here, from not just their actions, but expressions and even gestures. So, on your first job, maybe you don't really understand how things work, and you misinterpret what people are saying or doing, but after you've been in it for a while, you can figure out what their inclinations and motives are from the way that they look at you, or the way that they gesture, or the tone of voice, not just their actions themselves. So this also, he says, general observations treasured up by a course of experience give us the clue of human nature and teach us to unravel all of its intricacies. Now, it's important that he's talking about unraveling these intricacies given the next things that he's going to say, because he's going to bring up two possible sets of objections to this great uniformity of human nature. One of them is, well, wait a second, what about the differences that we do observe between different people and different peoples, different groups, different communities, different cultures, different civilizations even? We see that that's the case. So if human nature is the same, shouldn't it all be similar in doing exactly the same sort of thing? And he says, no. We can deal with this. The first thing that we need to know, as he says, we must not expect this uniformity of human action should be carried to such a length such that all men in the same circumstances will act precisely in the same manner without making any allowance for diversity. Diversity of what? Characters, prejudices, and opinions. He says, from observing the variety of conduct in different people, we're enabled to form a greater variety of maxims, which, however, still suppose a degree of uniformity and regularity. So maxims are rules that we use in order to figure out what's coming next or to guide our action. So, if we say everybody's out for themselves, that's a maxim, right? And that's a maxim that probably is pretty easy to refute just by finding a person who's not just out for themselves but is publicly minded, right? So we need a wider variety of maxims, but they're all still within the same basic system, he says. So what causes these differences? He says, are the manners of people different in different ages and countries? Well, we learn the great force of custom and education, which mold the human mind from its infancy and form it into a fixed and established character. So maybe the Greeks and Romans are in fact different. I mean, the Romans felt themselves different from the Greeks, and the Greeks felt themselves different from the Romans, right? And so that would be attributable to custom and education. Even among the Greeks, we could talk about the age-old difference between the Spartans and the Athenians, and there's so many others as well that we could talk about. But that's the one that every textbook likes to discuss, right? The aristocratic, warlike Spartans and the democratic, although there were aristocrats there as well, and warlike, just not warlike in the same way that the Spartans were, Athenians. I mean, the Athenians were viewed as sort of the evil empire of the time, and the Spartans were viewed as the liberators during the Peloponnesian War by some of the Greeks. So all of that has to do with the force of custom and education. People are brought up differently with different ideas, and those affect their motivations and their conduct. He also says, listen, there's different characters of, for example, the sexes. He says, is the behavior and conduct of the one sex very unlike that of the other? Thence we become acquainted with the different characters nature has impressed upon the sexes, and which she preserves with constancy and regularity. So, nowadays we'd call Hume a gender essentialist, right? And it was quite common in his time to do so. That's why Mary Wollstonecraft, writing not long after Hume, would say, hey, a lot of these things that you're saying are different characters of sexes coming from nature are actually coming from the force of custom and education, and demonstrating that in her own life. Different ages of life. We don't expect the same motivations and behavior from a 70-year-old as we do from a 7-year-old. Hopefully not, unless the 70-year-old has gone senile, right, and thinks that they're a child again. And we similarly expect that as a person ages and matures, there's some things they're going to leave behind, some perspectives, some motivations, and there's others that they're going to pick up. Some of those could, in fact, be attributable to nature. Think about what puberty does to us, right? Suddenly you're, not quite as interested in candy, and you're way more interested in whatever sex you're attracted to. We can even talk about individual characters having a certain kind of regularity. It says the characters peculiar to each individual have a uniformity in their influence. Otherwise, our acquaintance with the persons and our observations of their conduct could never teach us their dispositions or serve to direct our behavior with respect to them. So, Hume is saying we can still say that human nature is essentially universal, constant, the same everywhere. It's just going to be way more complicated, and there'll be all these other things sort of intervening. Another issue that he brings up that he really does have to address, well, what about actions that are out of character? When a person does things and you're like, what's going on there? That doesn't seem to be the way that we expect this person over here to behave. And he says, if we could know what judgment should be formed of such irregular and extraordinary actions, we can consider the sentiments commonly entertained with regard to those irregular events which appear in the course of nature. All causes are not conjoined to their usual effects with like uniformity, right? People are complex. He says that people who understand the human body realize that it is a mighty complicated machine, that many secret powers lurk in it which are altogether beyond our comprehension, and that to us it must appear very uncertain in its operations and irregular. And then he says, the philosopher, if the philosopher wants to be consistent, must apply the same reasoning to the actions and volitions of intelligent agents. We will do things every once in a while that appear to be out of character. They are actually caused, according to Hume, and they're following from human nature. It's just that we don't actually see what's going on, so we're surprised by it. He says the most irregular and unexpected resolutions can be accounted for by those who know every particular circumstance of their character and situation. So a person of obliging disposition gives a peevish answer, right? Nowadays we'd say a person who's nice acts like a jerk. And we say, oh, what's going on there? Well, there's some sort of hidden cause. And if you knew the person well enough, you would be able to discern why they're behaving in that way. A stupid fellow discovers an uncommon alacrity in his carriage, right? So a stupid person, somebody who doesn't pay attention to things, manages to get things right. So turns out he's met with a sudden piece of good fortune. And he says, even when an action, as sometimes happens, cannot be particularly accounted for, either by the person himself or by others, we know, in general, that the characters of men are to a certain degree inconstant and irregular. It reminds me of Aristotle's dictum in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 3, about the person who is consistently inconsistent, right? So that is able to, you could say, address this problem of out-of-character actions. There's some sort of cause, and that produces the exception. Now, before we end this, we should think about, why does Hume need to say this? Why is he so firmly committed to this doctrine? Is this just something that he wants to hold on to because he's really attracted to this idea? I would say no, and this goes a little bit beyond the text. Once you actually start to say that cause and effect, and Hume thinks that we know everything about the world that's not just coming from our senses and memory through cause and effect and the inference of cause and effect. Once you start to take that away and you've got human beings in the world, by take it away I mean to say that there is no such thing as like absolute causality out there as far as we know, right? We just observe this thing happening and our minds work that way. Then if people were fundamentally different from each other, we really wouldn't be able to understand human actions and motivations. This would be a big problem. This would mean that it could, in fact, be the case that foreign cultures are entirely foreign or alien to us, and we could never understand them. Hume doesn't want to say that. So Hume needs to make this sort of assertion, and these are the reasons, the arguments by which he makes and defends this position.